Hi, my name is Greg Bishop, and I'm the author of a book called Project Beta, which is about a strange episode that happened here in New Mexico in the late 70s and early 80s. Well, I had a bunch of book proposals out. Luckily, the publisher decided on Project Beta, which is what it was called from the beginning. I knew one of the principals in the story, Bill Moore, who's a UFO researcher. He's the co-author of the first book on the Roswell incident, which came out in 1979. After he wrote the Roswell incident, some people in the government said, you're the only person who knows what they're talking about that we've heard, kind of flattering him. And he became involved with this story of Paul Bennewitz, who was an electrical physicist who lived in Albuquerque. He had his own company making instruments for various contractors, including the government, temperature and humidity instruments. And he started seeing things he thought were UFOs over Kirtland Air Force Base, which is right there in the middle of Albuquerque, or straddling it. He told the Air Force about this, and the Air Force became interested in how he knew these things and how he was picking up radio signals from the base. So they decided to take him into their confidence, so-called, and keep track of him. And get reports from him, what he was seeing, what he was recording, what he was videotaping, which turned out to be secret projects at the base. What you have to know about Bennewitz is that his company, Thunder Scientific, was located right on the wall of Kirtland Air Force Base and right near the Wyoming gate, where Wyoming Avenue goes into Kirtland. And his house, which still exists and his family still lives in, is in the Four Hills area, which also overlooks Kirtland Air Force Base. So he, no matter what he did, he had sort of an intimate relationship with the Air Force by proximity alone. Well, Paul would go out in his backyard or on his deck, which overlooked Kirtland Air Force Base, the Manzano Mountain, Albuquerque Airport, obviously. He'd go out there in the winter, and in 1979, that's when this started, and he'd see these lights kind of blinking on. He saw actually people walking around them with flashlights he could see through binoculars. Then these lights out, then the guys with the flashlights would go away. The lights would lift off, 1, 2, sometimes more, maybe 3. They would lift off of the ground. They'd fly over Manzano Mountain, then drop down behind it. He started videotaping this, filming it with an 8mm film camera. And this was one of the things that he informed the Air Force about. He said, did you know that there's UFOs flying around on your Air Force base? Obviously they knew this, but he thought he was doing them a service by saying, I think something's going on here you ought to know about. And the Air Force said, why? No, we don't, Paul. Why don't you come down and talk to us about it? So he went down to the base and gave them a briefing and showed his films and his videos and played the tapes of these radio transmissions. And people that had purview over certain areas of the base said, well, yes, this is interesting to us. Specifically, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, which is basically the Air Force's FBI or police force, said, yes, we're very interested in this. And the reason they said that is because they wanted to know how he knew what he knew, how he was finding it out, so they could keep other people from finding it out, specifically at the time the Russians, because this was right in the middle of the Cold War, Reagan years, etc. So they wanted to, if there was a security leak, plug it up. And the best way to do this was not to tell him to shut up and stop it, although they could have done that, but was to get him to cooperate with them and say, tell him exactly what he was doing, tell them exactly what he was doing, and how he was finding this out. And also, importantly, to find out if he was giving this information to other people unwittingly. I think they knew that he wasn't some sort of a spy, but they wanted to know if he was talking to people who possibly were, because Russian agents were in this country. They would hang out in military bases, sometimes saying they were UFO researchers, and take pictures of things. Apparently, Bennewitz was not talking to any Russian agents or anything like that, but he was finding things out that he wasn't supposed to know. So why not lead him along, have him give them specific, detailed reports about what he was doing to find out what he was finding out, and how to direct his attention away from these things, other people's attention away from these things, and to plug up any security leaks if there were any. Because of Bennewitz's personality and what he was interested in, he was pretty obsessed with what was going on. This was like the greater part of his life. He had to actually have other people start running his business because he was so obsessed with this subject. And people want to ascribe the whole thing to the NSA or the Air Force OSI or something, saying they drove him crazy. Well, he helped them. But they did nothing to stop it. That was their problem. They let him continue in his folly and encouraged it. If he said, I think there's a base somewhere, which he thought was Dulce, New Mexico, they were perfectly happy to encourage that and get his attention away from Kirtland Air Force Base into another area of the state, namely Dulce, New Mexico, where he thought there was some sort of facility, underground facility. And they said, okay, there's an underground facility there, and encouraged him by doing such things as planting props up on Archuleta Mesa, and they flew him over in a helicopter and pointed them out to him just to encourage him in that direction. I mean, it got crazier and crazier. At this point, I think maybe there was some facility here, possibly, or something going on here. And by drawing his attention over here and having him talk about that, more people would come out of the woodwork and talk to him about this, and they could check on those people's backgrounds. The fact that he was so obsessed with the subject and believed anything he was told and anything that he came up with, that it kind of virtually created somebody that nobody that was serious would listen to. It just turned out that way. I'm sure the Air Force and other people that had projects at Kirtland were perfectly happy about that. They didn't mind if he was getting more and more obsessed and all that. It was fine with them. At a certain point, he was chain smoking. He was, insomniac. Basically, he couldn't function anymore, and still the Air Force just kept cooperating with him and telling him what was what they thought was going on, and we're so interested in all that. And people ask me, in the book, you don't have any moral problem with anything. Well, I do have a moral problem with it, and that's it. But it wasn't my job in the book to tell people how to feel. It was to report it. You read a news story or something like that, they're not telling you what to think. That's an editorial. I wasn't writing an editorial. I was writing a book about some events that happened and what happened to people, the human story. The genesis of all this Dulce stuff was that very early on, this woman was apparently, supposedly, abducted. At least she had a UFO experience in eastern New Mexico near Eagle's Nest, Cimarron, that area. And she came to Paul Benowitz's house and was hypnotically regressed by this researcher from Wyoming named Leo Sprinkle. He's a psychologist. He's been doing UFO research since the 1970s. She said that she had seen a cow, being drawn up into this UFO. And she'd also described some kind of underground facility. Now, Paul Benowitz was in communication with Gabe Valdez, who was the state highway patrol officer here in Dulce, and he was dealing with a lot of cattle mutilation events, cases here. So I think what happened was that Paul put two and two together and said cattle mutilations, Dulce. People were also seeing weird things flying around here. So I think he assumed that that's what was going on, and that underground base that this abductee woman had described was in fact up here in Dulce somewhere, and the Air Force decided to encourage him in that direction. So, and they started, encouraging his interest, encouraging his beliefs, and actually feeding him stories about what was going on up here. And a lot of that stuff, a lot of those stories entered the UFO literature and was, and continues to this day. A lot of it is at the conference in Dulce today I think is based on a lot of that disinformation. Yeah, well, when I finished Project Beta, because of all these stories and because of the disinformation campaign and the nature of it and how it came into being, I thought, well, most of this, if not all of it, is based on one guy's ideas about what was going on and the encouragement of intelligence operatives that just decided to let him go on with this and helped him with it. Made up basically out of whole cloth just because that's what they wanted him to believe. But when I decided, when I heard that the conference was going on here, I asked the organizer, hey, I'd like to come out and talk about it. Magically, seemingly, and before that a little bit too, but I started finding people who said they had worked with the government and, maybe they're doing a Benowitz on me, I don't know. That there is a facility here, or was. It may not be under Archuleta Mesa, it's somewhere in the area, but they seem to think that there's some sort of facility here. It's been documented in lots of places. There's a good book called Underground Bases and Tunnels by Richard Sauter. That there are underground facilities. Now, how extensive these are, I don't know. Some people think they're everywhere, and there's tunnels going from Nevada to New Mexico to Washington, D.C., to the northern part of the country. I do not know if that's true. But like I said, people who have no reason really to mislead me said, yeah, I think there was something there. And people that represent themselves as being in the government. One guy said that he used to work in the tunnel system. And he said, oh yeah, I knew there was some kind of nexus or terminus or something near the Dulce area. Now, how do I prove that? I don't know. But it makes me start to wonder, maybe there is something here. And what would be the reason for having people, pointing Paul Benowitz over here? Well, let's get somebody that nobody believes anyway and have them spread stories about the place. And it's worked. I mean, there's stories all over the place about Dulce now. And kind of a hiding in plain sight thing, scenario. If you're going to say there's an alien base in Dulce or anywhere, first you're going to have to get a segment of people that believe there's extraterrestrial aliens running around on the Earth. And then past that, they have some sort of agreement with the government or not an agreement, but have bases here. It starts to get so far into speculation that I don't know where that ends, but there's a certain segment of the population that's always going to be attracted to those stories and believe in it. Now, for myself, I don't think it's been proven that there's extraterrestrials coming here from anywhere. There's certainly been proven there's something strange that flies through the air once in a while that people see, and sometimes apparently land and interact with people. I don't know where those things come from. There's too many of the stories for me to think that there's not something weird going on. Now, to take that leap and say that they have bases here and all this, there's no real way to prove that. It could be true, I don't know. But it's hard for me with the way I think about things to say, oh yes, there's bases here, obviously, or even really seriously consider it. I'll listen to it. I'll think that it's a possibility, but I've got this sliding scale of probability, and it's like way down below 5%. Yeah, the Phil Schneider case. You can look up videos of his lectures. He was murdered apparently in Oregon about 10 years ago, something like that. He's got all the stories about working at the Dulce base, about aliens working with humans, about some sort of a battle underground where a bunch of security guards were killed. Like I said about these other things, once again, how do you check up on something like that? Unless somebody comes out with video or photo. Well, video and photos can be altered too. But some kind of evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that it was actually telling the truth. I don't know what to make of it. Either he was totally lying about it, or he was talking about these things because he was supposed to perpetuate that story. How much of it was true, I don't know. But perpetuate the story and the myth and the lore about the Dulce base. Exactly. I'm not trying to deny that there was some strange thing surrounding his death. But like I said, the best way to get attention for something is have a red flag like that go up. And why is the attention being drawn to it? On the other hand, he could have been telling mostly the truth and somebody killed him. I don't know. And maybe Phil Schneider was nuts and he said, I'm predicting my death, and, maybe he was in a fight with somebody. Maybe he did it himself and, wrapped the surgical tubing around his neck. I don't know. I mean, it sounds like I'm speculating too much now too. But so many holes in the story that until something concrete comes out that can be proven in more ways than somebody just telling a story, what can you do with that story? There's not much you can do with it. You can put it on the back burner and see if something else comes up.